to share with you the story of women's suffrage in South Dakota within the context of the national movement. Now you may notice that I'm dressed very boldly today, or eccentrically as my son says. I wear these colors in tribute to the women suffragists who chose these to represent their movement. I wear white as the symbol of purity, purple meaning loyalty to the movement, and yellow, the color of sunflowers, and the symbol chosen by the movement, is also the color of hope. As I was prepping to put together this presentation, I came across an interesting story about women voting in Rapid City in 1890. The spring after statehood, women were very pleased to find out they could vote in school elections. And so they organized an all-city, all-woman, all-party convention, and they nominated 4 women to run for school board seats. On election day, more than 1/4 of the women in the city voted, eligible women voted, and after all the votes were counted, they discovered that 3 of the 4 women had won their elections. Now, voting in school elections was the first chance women had to go to the polls, but it would take many years, many campaigns, and many heartaches before they finally were able to vote equal to men. The talk today is going to be in 4 components. First, I'll talk about why women wanted to vote. I will provide information about what happened coast to coast nationally, what some of the important South Dakota events were, and then how we finally got the 19th Amendment passed and some of the things that happened after. Why did women want to vote? Well, in the early 1800s, as women were getting better opportunities for education and entering the workforce, they became much more aware of how poorly they were treated by the legal system. Working women had no legal recourse for abuses by their employers, for poor wages or poor working conditions. Married women really weren't even legal entities. They could not sign legal papers. They could not own property. They could not sue or be sued. They could not have wages that belonged to them. All of their wages belonged to their husbands. And worst of all, if a woman divorced, she had no right to the custody of her own children. To give you sort of a concept of what the attitude may have been like at that time, women started trying to reform the laws to give them more property rights. And as they worked towards this sort of reform, they realized they needed the vote. But what they had to contend against were attitudes that are expressed by a couple of legislators in actually Wisconsin in about the mid-1800s. One of them wrote, "Giving property rights to women would be injurious to husbands, as then a wife's welfare and feelings and thoughts would not be all wrapped up in his happiness." Another man wrote, "Women's property rights would destroy the character of a wife and were contrary to the express commands of the Bible." In order for women to make the reforms that they wanted, which they recognized they needed the vote to happen, they also had to find a way to change these attitudes. So in the time frame before the Civil War, there wasn't a lot of organized agitation, but it was a time period where women were learning the skills that they would need for that fight. In 1848, there was a women's convention in Seneca, New York. Both men and women attended, and they came out with a declaration of principles of what they felt should happen for women to get equal rights. One of those rights was the right to vote. But women had no public relations skills. At that time, it was frowned upon for a woman to even speak in public. She certainly didn't know how to organize, run campaigns. They didn't even know how to run meetings. But in this time period, they started joining organizations and learning many of those skills. Many women joined anti-slavery organizations and learned to speak publicly. Then they also got involved in temperance and reform efforts. Again, it was sort of a training ground for building up the skills they would need to advocate for their rights. Once they started organizing, they came up with some strategies. How were they going to get this vote? Well, first they tried to argue it's already in the Constitution. When that didn't work, they said, we've got to convince Congress to change the Constitution. We'll need a constitutional amendment. And as that seemed to flounder, they said, all right, let's just go and see how many states we can get the amendments to their constitutions that would then give women the right to vote, at least in some states. Now, in some states, women recognized that was never going to happen, so they had an alternative strategy. which was to get partial vote. Again, things like, well, maybe they'll let us vote in school elections, all hoping that at some point it would end up with full voting rights for all women in all states. I want to go through a time frame with you right now to sort of show you how it unfolded in terms of trying to get that constitutional amendment passed, and I'll also talk about how they tried to say it was already in the Constitution. So before I go into the detail of this timeline, I want you to sort of understand how it is put together. So think of it as it's in decades, so every hash mark here is 10 years. And we start with that meeting in Seneca Falls where women publicly said we should have the right to vote. The Civil War happens in the 1860 time frame. South Dakota becomes a state in 1889. And then women vote in 1920. This is when the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, passed the United States. And that happened right after World War I. So keep in mind that we're looking at all of these decades. And there's going to be a lot of information I go through, and it's really important just to focus on where things fall on the timeline. The first real effort that the suffragists made in an organized fashion was during the Reconstruction era, after the Civil War, as the amendments were being debated to abolish slavery, to make the freed slaves citizens, and to give them the right to vote. The American Equal Rights Association was created in 1866 to advocate to include women in those amendments, but unfortunately they did not succeed. They did find a senator who was willing to then propose an amendment to the Constitution. Nothing happened with it, but it did get proposed for the first time in that time frame. After those three amendments were passed, the women suffragists thought, I think there's a clause in the 14th Amendment that talks about equal protection under the law that might work and be a good argument that we can now vote. So they tried to vote, it went to the Supreme Court, and in 1872 the Supreme Court said, no, citizenship, which was also part of the 14th Amendment, does not naturally confer suffrage. Then in 1878, Susan B. Anthony, who was in charge of the national organization, wrote the words to a women's suffrage amendment. It was proposed, and the words that she proposed in 1878 are now enshrined in the Constitution. I want all of you to guess for a minute, when do you think Congress actually voted for the first time on the Anthony Amendment? When both houses of Congress in the same session voted, just even voted on it. Now, in the meantime, there was a lot of times where the amendment was proposed, it might go to committee, there might be hearings, but when do you think it actually got a vote? Well, if you guessed 1914, you were right. It was a long period of time, there was a lot of agitation, but not much success. But after 1414, it didn't take long, and in 1919, Congress did pass the 19th Amendment. It was ratified in 2020, in August, and then all women could vote. Well, not really. White women pretty much could vote after 1920, but the fact was American Indians weren't even citizens until 1924, and as we all know, the Jim Crow laws and segregation in the South prevented most Black Americans from access to the polls. So the key takeaway from the effort to convince Congress to modify the amendment was that it took a long time and there wasn't a lot of success. So as a result, the suffragists started a strategy of working state by state. And the first state that they were able to convince to even have an amendment to amend their constitution was in Kansas. In 1866, it did not succeed. But lo and behold, in 1869, the territory of Wyoming voted to allow women the right to vote. Now, a territory does not have a constitution, so that meant all it took was the vote by the two houses of the legislature and the signature of the governor. And Wyoming Territory in 1869 became the first place where women had full voting rights. Utah followed not soon after, but they only were able to vote until 1887 because Congress revoked that right when they passed a law making polygamy illegal. Michigan tried in about that same time frame, but they did not succeed. And after that, there were many amendments, many states, and many failures. But another territory in the 1880s, Washington also passed a law so women could vote, but the state Supreme Court declared that illegal a few years later. Finally, 1889 to 1906, there were 4 states that passed amendments giving women the right to vote. Now actually in Wyoming it wasn't an amendment, it was as Wyoming transitioned from being a territory to a state, it was part of their state constitution. Therefore, Colorado was the first state where the voters approved an amendment that gave women the right to vote. Utah came into the statehood with a constitution that said women could vote, and Idaho was another state where the voters approved a constitutional amendment. It took another 12 years before there were any more successes, and then a whole bunch of them happened in a very fast amount of time. This was 1910 to 1917. In that 7 years, 8 states and the territory of Alaska. Now, a lot of the reason for this was it was the Progressive Era. Most of these were Western states. In fact, the only 2 states east of the Missouri River were Michigan and New York. In the meantime, while many women were not able to vote in a lot of states, Montana elected Jeanette Rankin to be a congresswoman. So there was a woman serving in Congress when a lot of women in the country could not even vote. And finally, we have the last 3 amendments. States had amendment campaigns, and those states that won were South Dakota, Michigan, and Oklahoma. After that, the 19th Amendment was passed and ratified, and women gained the right to vote. The key takeaway from this slide is that there were many women in many states working very, very hard to achieve the right to vote. And when they weren't succeeding by getting state or the national constitutions amended, then they started working on partial suffrage. Now, partial suffrage allows women to vote in specific elections, but not in all elections. And there were 4 kinds of partial suffrage. School suffrage allowed them to vote in school elections. Municipal suffrage, city elections. Sometimes some states allowed women to vote on taxing and bonding issues. And in the last decade, before the 19th Amendment, they started realizing that women could vote for president without having to have a state constitution. And the benefit to all of these partial suffrage was that women actually also were winning elections. I want to talk just a little bit about school suffrage because it's important to recognize that it was a part of that whole process of convincing voters that women should vote. In 1848, the idea of women voting was radical. But as women gained access through partial suffrage, especially school suffrage, it gave them opportunities not just to vote, but to run campaigns, win elections, and serve in leadership positions, especially as county and state superintendents. The first woman to win a statewide election was Laura Kelly Eisenhuth in 1892 in North Dakota. The concept of school suffrage normalized women casting votes at the polls and gave them confidence also in casting ballots. It was also an acceptable type of voting, suitable for women because of their gender. So here's just a couple of things that were happening that as the suffragists were pursuing a national amendment and state amendments, is actually in 1838 was the first time women could vote in school matters. And in Kentucky, they allowed women who owned property and had children in school to vote. But it wasn't until 1861 that there was a more robust bill on school suffrage, and that passed in Kansas. Dakota Territory in 1879 changed the law so that women could vote at school meetings. Now, at that time, there really weren't school boards, so this was where all of the authority happened, where all the decisions were made. We're not sure very many women actually took advantage of this, but the law did say women could vote at meetings where they decided on taxes and they chose teachers. By 1900, there were 25 states where women were able to vote in school elections. So once again, key takeaway here is that long before the 19th Amendment, women were voting in many states, and that helped normalize the concept of women casting votes at the polls. Now let's take a look at where all of the states were in 1919. By 1919, there were already 16 states where women had gained full suffrage. There were several states where women had presidential suffrage. Many of them had school suffrage. If you look at this picture, something should jump out at you, and that is the fact that all of the full suffrage states pretty much seem to be in the western United States. And historians sort of have a lot of different theories about this. One of the theories is that this was the progressive era when a lot of these states voted to amend their constitutions, and many of the western states were very progressive. Another theory is that the West was more open to expanding their electorate than the eastern states, which had much more entrenched political machines. And another thing to keep in mind is that women were very organized and sophisticated in the western states, and they were very good at aligning themselves with other political groups so that they could work together to achieve their goals. So let's talk now about some of the events that happened in South Dakota. I'm going to tell you a little bit about women using their school suffrage, how they constructed their arguments, what role prohibition played in this whole movement, what type of legislation was proposed in both the territory and the state, and then how women ran some of those campaigns. I want you to stop and think a minute about what it must have felt for women to go to the polls for the very first time. These are women whose grandmothers had never voted, whose mothers had never voted, their daughters had never voted, their sisters had never voted. They were used to sort of focusing on the home, and now they had a chance to make their voices heard on public policy. It must have felt momentous. And a newspaper at the time actually captured that by writing, "Some of the women approached the ballot box with fear and trembling, and some of them at first refused to pass their ballots over to the judge." Now, in order for women to get these amendments passed, they had to persuade the male voters to add them to the electorate. And it took a while to develop some winning arguments. The arguments sort of fell into three types of categories. There was, it's our natural right, it's expedient, or we're loyal citizens. Some of the first arguments were more about justice, equal justice. Women should have the same rights as men. That argument did not quite persuade the male electorate. So then, as more and more women were involved in reform efforts and trying to improve the society, trying to improve their communities, they talked about expediency. Give us the right to vote and we will improve society. And one of those reform efforts they were very involved in was temperance, the issue dealing with the abuse of alcohol. And the abuse of alcohol was a very big societal problem, because when women had no property rights and the man drank all of the family money, women would become homeless and impoverished, and they would have no legal recourse. So stopping the abuse of alcohol was a huge reform issue of the era. That helped bring in a few converts, but not enough to pass the amendments. So the winning argument that they finally came up with was, look at how we have been civically engaged, improving our society. We are loyal citizens. We have a duty to vote. And the whole idea of women being loyal citizens with a duty to vote finally was one of the most winning arguments. But of course, there were arguments against suffrage. And probably the biggest argument against suffrage came from the fact that the electorate was a little concerned about the changing role of women in society. They had been used to women being focused on the home and not in public affairs. And just getting used to that changing role was hard. It was hard for people to change. So some of the arguments they expressed were, women have a higher and holier mission. They shouldn't get in the muck of politics. Or people were very afraid that women voting would disrupt society, that men would no longer be superior in all things, or have the higher authority in all things. And then sometimes they just claimed women didn't want the vote. And so they would make these arguments. Again, representing that attitude are a couple of quotes. For example, she was intended to aid in propagating the human race, to take care of the home, aid in rearing children, and to enjoy reasonable recreation and pleasure. Another person wrote, if their creator had intended them to be equal to man, he would not have made them different. The truth is, woman is simply auxiliary to man. These were the arguments that the suffragists had to overcome. In many states, the issue of prohibition and suffrage was very intertwined, and especially in South Dakota. So I had mentioned earlier, abuse of alcohol was a big problem. Women organized to try to address that issue, and they organized in a group called Women's Christian Temperance Union, called the WCTU. This was the largest organized group of women in the country, and they were very active, and they thought suffrage would be something that would help them achieve their goal. They really weren't only about temperance, they really were about reforming society. And many of the early suffragists came from that movement, and by agitating publicly and learning to be advocates, they actually were the leaders in some of the first suffrage movements. So let's talk about the laws that were proposed, the legislation that was proposed in South Dakota as women were agitating for the vote. Notice on this slide that Wyoming Territory passed women's suffrage in 1869, but even before that, South Dakota or Dakota Territory almost became the first place where women could vote. There was a bill proposed, it passed the House, but it languished in the Senate. A few years later, it passed in one house, and in the other house, it only lost by one vote. And then in 1883, it actually passed both houses, but the governor vetoed it. The governor was appointed by the president, and he felt that by passing this law, it would make it more difficult for South Dakota to become a state. So note here, Dakota Territory had 3 chances and could have been the first in the nation. South Dakota did obtain statehood in 1889, and in the Constitution, they did say women could vote in school elections. Unfortunately, it did not say they could vote for county superintendent of schools or state superintendent of schools, even though they could run for those offices. Right after statehood, there was an amendment to change the brand new Constitution, and a huge campaign, and suffragists from all over the country came and worked in the state, but it did fail. It only gained 1/3 of the voters. A few years later, there was an amendment to redress the problem with school suffrage, allowing women to vote for county and state superintendent. No one campaigned for it. There was no education on it. Voters probably didn't even know what it was all about, and it did not pass. Then South Dakota tried again. This was during the populist era, and they came very, very close to amending the South Dakota Constitution, authorizing women as voters. But then there wasn't another amendment for several years. The suffragists were still working. They were running petitions. They were organizing, but they did not get the legislature to put another amendment on the ballot until 1910. And then they had 3 right in a row. Now you'll notice in the 1910 amendment, they only got 38% of the vote. So they actually went backwards in terms of favorability from the 1898 vote. But then again in 1912, they got 44% of the vote. And by 1916, they had gotten all the way up to 48% of the vote. Finally, in 1918, they get a great majority with 63% of the vote. Key takeaway from South Dakota is there were a lot of chances for the state to enfranchise its women. And the women had to organize a lot, they had to work a lot, they had a lot of heartache, they had a lot of campaigns. But eventually they became one of the only 16 states that did enfranchise their women before the 19th Amendment. So let's talk about the first era of campaigns in South Dakota, the ones that happened in 1890, 1898, and 1910. They failed. Why did they fail? Well, part of the problem was that they were not able to separate their mission, their goal of voting, from the issue of prohibition. And that created some strong enemies, which was a well-funded enemy. The liquor lobby had plenty of money and a lot of influence in the legislature. The public actually considered prohibition and suffrage as sort of the same thing. If women were able to vote, they would have prohibition. The other problems they had was organizational infighting, especially in 1890. In 1890, South Dakota suffragists fought with each other, they fought with Susan B. Anthony, who was from the national organization, and all of those fights spilled out into the newspaper. Also, they were inexperienced. They weren't good campaigners. They didn't understand a lot of the ins and outs of politics, and so that worked against them. And in the beginning, their argument was not persuasive enough. In the second era, the 1914, 1916, and 1918 campaigns, they were much more sophisticated. In 1912, they had realized they had to separate the two issues of prohibition and suffrage. And so they organized under a whole new name, South Dakota Universal Franchise League. They nominated a president, Mamie Shields Pyle, who had never been known to be a part of the temperance movement. And they focused their message specifically on suffrage. Now, they still had well-funded opponents, but in 1916, all of the political parties endorsed them, which showed that the attitude and the interest in women voting was moving in their direction. An interesting thing had happened in 1916. Now, there was multiple amendments on the ballot. One of them was suffrage, one of them was prohibition. Prohibition passed with only men's votes. So that argument that, if women vote, then we'll have prohibition, really wasn't an argument anymore because they already had prohibition. So let's talk about the final campaign, 1918. As we know, they were getting better and better percentages approving women's suffrage. And this time, again, they were very organized, very sophisticated. They did petitions in every single county, meaning that they had advocates working in those counties. They mailed literature to all voters. And they focused on the message that women should have the right to vote because they are loyal citizens. And a very interesting thing was also happening in South Dakota, or in the country at the same time, is that it was the middle of World War I. Women had been very active in supporting the troops. And the enemy was Germany. There were 24% of the people living in South Dakota had German heritage. There was strong anti-German sentiment at the time, and non-citizens in South Dakota could vote. The women couldn't vote, but the non-citizens could. And the reason they could is there'd been a law in the books for a long time, and South Dakota was not the only state, that said as long as you had taken out first papers and declared that you wanted to be a citizen, you could vote. You didn't have to be naturalized. In the naturalization ceremony, you actually renounce any loyalty to another country, but you don't do that till you're naturalized. So the suffragists basically exploited nativism of the time, the strong anti-immigrant, anti-German fervor, to say things like, politically active women were more deserving of the franchise than their ignorant male immigrant neighbors. The governor called a special session of the legislature. They changed the wording of the amendment. Instead of the amendment being just about enfranchising women, they added a second clause. So now the amendment, while it did enfranchise women, it disenfranchised non-citizens. And so when people would go in to vote, they had to vote on both. Right? A yes meant enfranchise women, disenfranchise immigrants. So in the end, although we celebrate the fact that in 1918 South Dakota did approve women's suffrage, we do not really know if the voters were voting for the disenfranchise clause or the enfranchise clause. But in the end, it passed with 63%, and we can look back to that time as being a time when citizens recognized, or when voters recognized, that citizenship did also mean suffrage. Remember that 1872 Supreme Court decision that said those two are not the same? By 1918, the public was now convinced that citizenship and suffrage were together, belonged together. Soon after South Dakota passed their amendment, the 19th Amendment passed. And I'm just going to walk through a few steps as to exactly how that happened in 1919. First thing that happened was that Prohibition passed in January again silencing the strongest opposition. Then in the spring, after several legislatures throughout the country met, many of them passed laws that said women could vote in presidential primaries. Well, at the end of all of those sessions, someone counted it up and saw that 15 million women in the country now had either full suffrage or they could vote in presidential elections, meaning 15 million women could now vote for President of the United States in 32 states. What this meant is that the Electoral College now had a majority of states where women could vote. And the politicians took notice, as they always do, as to who can vote for them, and they decided it was time to pass the 19th Amendment. There was actually a special session of Congress, and they passed it on June 4th. And on December 4th, South Dakota became the 21st state to ratify. The last state to ratify was Tennessee in August of 1920. Now, it took 36 states to ratify it, and Tennessee was pretty much the last chance. Most of the other states who had not ratified it had either voted not to ratify it or had said they're not going to even call a session of their legislature to vote on it. So it was pretty much the last chance, and it was quite a dramatic moment. A lot of the legislators in Tennessee had said, yeah, we'll vote for suffrage, but then there was a lot of lobbying happening and they were changing their minds. The Senate in Tennessee ratified the law, and then it was time for the House. And at that time, if you were pro-suffrage, you wore a yellow rose on your lapel. If you were anti-suffrage, you wore a red rose on your lapel. The House went to vote, and the first motion was to table the ratification, and the vote was tied, 48 to 48. They voted again. It was 48 to 48. And then they voted on the merits of the bill, and the last person to vote was one of those who had been wearing a red rose, who had voted yes to table it. He was the last person to vote, and he changed his mind, and history was made. Now, the interesting thing is that legislator was 24 years old, and in the pocket of his coat, of his shirt, underneath his coat was a letter from his mother that said, "Vote for the ladies." And so because of his mother, we now have the 19th Amendment. And on August 26th, it became formal, and women now had the right to vote. But as I said before, in 1920, it was mostly white women who had the right to vote. As soon as the amendment was ratified, the women suffragists did not just go away, they transitioned the suffrage organizations into the League of Women Voters, which exists today, whose mission is to educate voters, to encourage women to run for elective office, and to protect voting rights. Now, there was a certain group of women who did not get the right to vote until 1922, because a law had passed in 1907 that said if you married an immigrant, you no longer were a citizen. So if your family had been in the country since the Mayflower and you married an immigrant, you lost your rights as a citizen, which means in 1920, if you were a woman and you thought you could vote, you couldn't until that law was repealed. I've already talked about the American Citizenship Act, which made Americans Indian citizens so they could vote. But in fact, many states actually had laws on the books and wrote laws to prevent them from voting, and it wasn't until 1951 that South Dakota removed the final law preventing American Indians from voting. And we also know that because of segregation and Jim Crow laws, that many African Americans basically had no access to the ballot until in the 1960s they passed the 24th Amendment outlawing poll taxes. And right after that came the Voting Rights Act, giving Black Americans much better access to the ballot box. Well, that's not the end of the United States expanding its electorate, because don't forget, during the Vietnam War, there was a lot of agitation to reduce the voting age, and so instead of 21 being the minimum voting age, it is now 18. And even today, we are still debating voting rights. We know that there's still a lot of discussion about who should have the right to vote, what the voting rules should be. So 100 years later, We are still debating voting rights. We are still debating who should be able to vote, what are the rules for voting. So 100 years after the 19th Amendment and women obtained the right to vote, voting rights is still an issue. But that's a discussion for another day. This overview has included an awful lot of detail and an awful lot of dates. So if you take away anything, any impression from what you've learned today, it is this. The campaign for women's suffrage was a multi-generational public relations campaign started by women with inferior legal rights and few public speaking and organizational skills. It was waged in every state against powerful and well-funded opposition who would not concede women's right to full voting equality. The only way to win was to convince the men to vote in favor of women's voting rights. And the women won. If you are interested in learning more about the topic of women's suffrage and school suffrage, South Dakota Historical Society published a book last year called Equality at the Ballot Box, and it has numerous essays about the fight in many of the Northern Plains states, and I recommend that book. Thank you, and I hope you learned some interesting facts about the fight for women's suffrage in South Dakota.